So,
All right, and welcome to Friday Night Feels, everyone. Woo! I am licensed mental health counselor and certified life coach Patrick Monette, and I welcome you to another episode of Friday Night Feels. Friday Night Feels is a show that focuses on a variety of wellness related issues, such as mental health, wellness, stress management, men's health, relationship issues, mindfulness, and much more. The focus of the show is to create connection and to be able to talk about issues that affect all of us and how to be the healthiest versions of ourselves that we can be. Each show, I invite a guest to join me to discuss their experiences with healing, wellness, and personal development. And I am so excited today for the show because it's been in the works for such a long time. Is a dear friend and colleague, is Dr. Mara Tesler Stein. So welcome to Friday Night Feels, Mara.
I am
Woo!
so excited to be here. Thank you for inviting me,
Right.
Patrick. It's a long time
And
coming.
yes, and we're both in our hobbit holes because we're
We
so
are
connected. So it's totally
totally.
appropriate. So
Yes.
I just want to share a little feedback about Mara so you can see how amazing she is and why I'm so excited she's here. So Dr. Mara Tesler Stein is a clinical psychologist, an EMDR consultant and trainer in Chicago and Jerusalem. She's the founder and director of the Touchstone Institute for Perinatal Training, where she offers advanced EMDR trainings, which take deep dives into the intersections and applications of EMDR in perinatal mental health. As senior faculty with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, she also offers foundational EMDR trainings for perinatal specialists. She is an advocate for trauma focused care and is trained and certified in a range of integrative trauma therapies, such as emotional focused therapy, couple therapy, brain spotting, is a Gottman certified therapist, and continues to deepen her training in clinical hypnosis, yoga informed treatment, advanced applications of EMDR, and ego state therapies. Her trauma work is grounded in her own personal perinatal journey, which began 27 years ago, taking her through infertility, twin pregnancy, prolonged hospital bed rest, the NICU, and years of raising NICU graduates. So, Mara, I'm so excited you're here. It's
Thank
happening.
you. Yay.
Friday Night Feels. So, I mean, we could really do a whole series for probably like 2 years just to kind of cover all the stuff that you and I normally talk about. But one of
Totally.
the so you'll have to come back. It's already in the books. It's
Yay.
happening.
All right.
Once you're part of the Friday Night Feels family, you always
That's it.
are.
You're in. Yeah. Good.
So one of the things that you and I have talked about, one of the aspects is first of all, I'd like to ask is like, where would you like to start a little bit of you and I
Hmm.
Sorry, I have so many. I've had a little too much caffeine today, so my thoughts are all around. And I'm just so excited because you and I have so many great discussions about EMDR, perinatal treatment, perinatal related issues, and also couples work, which is
Yes.
very, I believe, a unique combination of interests in our field.
Absolutely. And I got to couples work because of the perinatal work I was doing.
Okay,
Because when you work with perinatal mental health, you're seeing new parents, often new moms. You end up seeing couples.
great,
I
great,
also started off as a child psychologist early in my training. So the first 10 years of my clinical work, maybe 12 years, I was seeing all range of kids through adolescence. And then I stopped seeing very small kids a little bit over time. But when you're seeing kids, you're seeing parents.
right, right.
So that work really brought me into couples work. But yeah, I think it's an important combo.
And it's interesting how many conversations you and I have had of the lack of trained professionals who do all three.
It's true.
You might
It's
get perinatal, and then you might
Yeah.
get EMDR, and then you might get couples. And so,
Yeah.
one of the conversations that you and I have been having ongoing is about creating more conversations, more space, more trainings to talk about these issues. That it's interesting. One of the things that I've experienced as a clinician is, and I think you and I may have talked about this, where in my grad program, I don't know if I ever heard the word perinatal.
Oh, me either.
And it was never a discussion.
Wasn't included.
It wasn't
No.
included at all.
Yeah.
And And then also, I think for me being a man and not having children, there is a lot of like separation from that. But then once all of a sudden you're in the field and you start seeing couples, which I've done since grad school, which I've always loved, you see these issues bleed in.
Absolutely.
And all of a
It
sudden,
is, yeah,
and I love that you are trained in different couples approaches, because there's so much that we need, and there's so much that couples require, right?
absolutely. And couples can come in for one reason, and then another kind of trauma can erupt, so like in the years that I was seeing couples, I didn't always get couples from the perinatal direction, but then they'd get pregnant. And
Right.
then, right, and then all the stuff that starts to happen around pregnancy, birth, postpartum starts to come into play in the couples work too.
Right. And it's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I've experienced is in a lot of trainings, like with perinatal, the focus tends to be on the birth parent
Yes. Yes.
and just their experience and all of that. And I remember I was listening to something once and I said, well, where's the other parent?
Where's the other
Like
parent? I know.
where in
Yeah.
it, whether it's whatever dynamic of the relationship is what's happening with that other person's process, with the partner's process. Where's, especially when we're talking about perinatal related traumas, what supports are there not only for the birth parent but also for the partner,
Yeah.
and the support of seeing them together. And what I've seen in a lot of couples work is, and I'm just going to reflect on um heterosexual couples at this time, just because that's
Okay.
more of my experience with
Okay.
a man, heterosexual. Oh, the word just jumped out of my head. Um, Man and women. I'm sorry.
Sure.
um,
Cis het
and
couples.
thank you so much. Sorry, and being able to see that the woman really struggles when there's a loss, or when there's infertility, or when there's struggles with any sort of related issues with the pregnancy or baby or loss, wants to talk about it, wants to talk about it, wants to talk about it, needs to process, needs to be there. And the man stereotypically like doesn't want to at all.
Mhm. Mhm.
And we actually created a group with a local non-for-profit organization I work with, where we created a group for men, for fathers, and we called it So I Don't Want to Talk About It. That's the name of the group.
Best name. It's
And
the
I'm like,
best
let's
name.
just keep it real. And we don't want to talk about it. You don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it. And
Yeah.
that, let's normalize that a little bit. What are your experience with that? Based on what I'm sharing with mine.
Yeah. I think what I often hear with cishet couples is that the birthing partner, the woman, there's so much shame for many people, where there's infertility, where there's a problem in pregnancy, where there's something wrong with the baby, or the baby needs NICU care, or the baby dies. Because the process of pregnancy happens in the body, but it
Hmm.
only happens in the body of one person, even though it takes two people to make a baby. The
Right.
gestation happens and the birth happens with one person. So I think that what happens is that there's a very deep sense of responsibility for this process. And if something goes wrong, there's this sort of myth of like, how could I have not known? Or how could I have not
Mm,
controlled that? So there's this really deep responsibility and shame where things go out when things go off track. And
mm,
then for the non-birthing partner, the very common response is, well, I'm supposed to be there to support her.
mhm,
And
mhm,
so unless it's explicitly created and named over and over again, very often the non-birthing partner like almost doesn't feel like they're allowed
mhm,
to feel or say or experience, because they're
mhm.
supposed to support the birthing partner.
Right. And also, I love how you focus on that, of the physicality of it. Well, it's not my body. It
I hear
wasn't
that
so.
all the time. And,
eh,
I have very often said to men, but it is your baby
and
and it
your
is
partner.
also your experience and your partner. So when you think about who's traumatized and who people are afraid for. When you think about the non-birthing partner, so the birthing person may or may not be scared for their own life, even if their own life is in danger.
Right.
But there's lots of fear around what's happening to the baby.
Right. Right.
Right. There may be fear also about, like, especially if there's, trauma, physical trauma in birthing. Am I going to die? Is my baby going to die? What's happening to my body? Absolutely, that happens as well. But for the non-birthing partner, so they're scared for their wife, if it's
Mhm.
a said couple, they're scared for the birthing person and for the baby.
Right.
Right. And
And
often
then
they end up
also,
feeling. Mhm.
and then managing or hopefully managing the outside world, who,
Exactly.
as we know, the questions, which we can get into
Oh,
a little bit,
totally.
the
We could do like a whole
questions.
series on that. But even, very much, they're the ones making the phone calls usually.
Right.
This is what's going on. No matter the circumstances. Baby
Right.
died, baby's in the NICU, baby's okay, but she's not, whatever is going
Right.
on. They're the liaison between, let's say a baby goes to the newborn intensive care unit. They're the ones shuttling back and forth. They're the first one to see the baby in the NICU, to talk to the doctors, to see what's going on. If a baby is dying, to have to deliver the news or to hear the news first. So there's a tremendous burden, and often so much trauma on the partner whose body hasn't gone through this, but
Right.
whose heart and soul and self
Right.
is going through this
And also, in addition to shame, I see a lot of guilt
so much. I should have
of I
known
should
better.
have
I should
done
have done
this. Is this my
something.
fault? My family, this, all of the what ifs. And it's interesting too when you're talking about trauma, specifically in the perinatal lens, and we're working with couples to be able to explore. Okay, so if there was a perinatal trauma, that's like one piece of the pie that I'm sure we assess. But another piece too is, how is the relationship, the connection
Oh,
before it even started,
yeah.
which I think sometimes people are afraid to ask because there's so much energy and there's so much going on with the loss or the trauma,
Yeah.
that the couple inadvertently get pushed to the backside somehow of like,
And it
wait,
makes
where's
and
the
it makes all the
relationship?
well, right, but also it makes a difference in how they're going to cope with the trauma very often.
Right.
Not to say that a securely attached couple can't really struggle in the aftermath of a perinatal crisis, because they absolutely can and do. But when you have something to go back to, right, to
Right.
remember what it's like, to know that your partner has your back, to
Right.
know that your partner understands you. Now, when you have had that and now you feel like, who are you and where have you gone and you don't understand a thing,
Hmm.
that's also devastating. But there's still the ingredients of that connection that you can really, if it was a good solid connection before the crisis, that you have like that foundation to at least look back on. But when
Hmm.
couples were struggling before a pregnancy, during a pregnancy, and then there's a crisis, then we've got an earthquake on top of
Hmm.
an
Hmm.
earthquake
Hmm.
on top of,
A
cracked
tsunami. Yep.
foundation. Yeah. So you're like, where can we stand? Like, what was there? What can we still find where you can find each other, where you can see each other?
Right. And then, as we know with trauma, when that's created a new wound,
Yes.
if one or both partners also have a history of trauma, when we're working with couples, this is definitely when I'm in EMDR language, when I'm doing the intake and when we're having those initial conversations, and also assessing their coping skills a little bit. I want to know more about their history as
Yes.
individuals and as a couple. How have you dealt with this, or where did you? One of the questions I love to ask is how did you learn about forgiveness?
Oh, oh.
Who taught you about forgiveness? Who, and then my other favorite question, and that usually opens up a whole can worm of questions, of conversation. And another question I always ask is, who was an example, a role model for you growing up of a romantic relationship that you saw? And what's interesting is I think in all of the years that I've done, couple therapy and coaching and hold me tight and everything, I think I've only had one couple say their parents.
Uh-huh.
Right. So,
Yeah.
normally we don't always think of romance as our parents are like, no,
Right,
no,
totally.
no. Like,
Ah.
but if you're looking at it, through the lens of attachment and through
Mhm.
examples and reference points of saying, and then I asked the couple, what do you want your children to answer?
Oh. Oh.
And then how can we get there? And I think when I'm working with the trauma and with perinatal related issues, excuse me, the idea of how do you find each other?
Mhm.
What are the expectations? What do you want from your partner? What are you contributing?
Yeah.
And if you don't know what you don't know, how do you
Mhm.
create a healthy relationship? So you
Mhm.
grow up and you have the idea of a structure of some sort of relationship. I blame Disney a lot for my dysfunction because happily ever
Absolutely.
after. And I always joke that I think the first cartoon that ever showed me a real relationship was Shrek.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there's trauma, there's issues, there's mental health, there's
Right. It's
selfishness, there's
messy. It's messy.
there's kids, there's in-laws, there's the swamp, there's the donkey that doesn't shut up, all of these things. And then, when you're dealing with all of the different life issues, like you're saying, if you don't have that secure attachment, and I look at the way I explain secure attachment for some people who may not know attachment language is it's sort of, I use an analogy of the circus. So it's sort of like when you see the people walking on the tightrope, and
Mm.
when they're learning, what do they have? They have a safety net.
Mhm.
And when that safety net is strong and healthy, when you fall, when life happens, that
Mhm.
relationship is going to bring you right back to safety.
Yep.
But when there's been more damage and more damage and more damage, the
Mhm.
strength of that safety net is going to be lost, and then you're going to hit the ground.
Right. And there's holes in it and you can't depend
Right.
on it.
And then you get up just like you were saying, and then you're disoriented and you can't find your person.
Yeah.
So this horrific, awful experiences happen, the scary, terrifying powerlessness, and then the isolation of you can't even find your partner.
Yeah. They feel like they're often in like two different worlds, two different kinds of experiences. And
Absolutely.
couples grieve differently. People grieve differently. People cope differently. And, when it's about the most important things in your children, your family, um, it's intense. It's intense, when one partner, wants all the details and all the information and to talk, and the other partner just wants to know the bottom line,
Right. Right.
or just tell
How
me
to
what I
fix
need
it?
to know.
How do I
How
fix
to
it?
fix it? What do I need to do? Yeah.
Yes. And we
Yep.
love the fixes. We don't want to get rid of that,
Absolutely.
but we always have the conversation.
Instrumental grief is a style of grief,
Yeah. And
and
it's
grief is
also you
not just
want to do
for, yeah,
something.
you want to do something. Right.
Let's
Right.
validate that. But
Yes.
we can
100%.
tweak what you want to do because what you're doing isn't working. Like I can fix it. I can beat the attendant up or I can yell at the doctor. It's like, well, that's
Right,
not going to
right.
get
Sometimes
us out
not
of the
so
pain.
helpful. Right. Well, and also, I think people sometimes think that instrumental grieving is avoidance, and they're not the
Mm,
same.
mhm.
Avoidance is more about numbing,
Right.
not feeling, not
Right.
engaging, where instrumental grieving is where the grief is expressed through action, through something
Hmm.
meaningful. So for a lot of instrumental grievers, which are often but not always male identified people, you can have dealing with the insurance company,
Hmm. Hmm.
or if you're in the US, or having to go back to work to keep the insurance, to keep the
Yes.
income, to preserve the paternity leave,
Right.
things like that are very pragmatic and intentional as ways to manage the intensity of what's going on. That might be the person doing all the research. That might be the person asking the questions. Whereas a partner who is maybe more on the intuitive is what we call the other end, the style we think of as, grieving, crying, talking, thinking, right? All the
Hmm.
swimming in the feelings, is more what we think of as healthy. Well, they're both healthy.
Hmm. Hmm.
They're different styles, and most people really have a mixture anyway.
Yes. Yes. And I love that you say that because that's probably one of the first conversations I have with couples when they're in turmoil. One of the stereotypical things that I hear is if we're talking about cisgendered heterosexual couples is he has no feelings.
Right.
He
He doesn't
doesn't
care.
he doesn't care. He's the Tin Man. I
Hmm.
don't even know if he's there half the time.
Hmm.
And I'm very direct with those conversations and
Good.
of that's inaccurate. And we
Uh-huh.
need to let that go because he has just as many emotions as you. He just has a different vocabulary. He expresses them differently.
Yeah.
And you know me, I use a little bit of humor. And I'm like, would you want to marry yourself? And they're like, oh God, no. And I'm like, right. You fell in love with him or you fell in love with each other because you are different and you blend well and you dance well together. But when there's pain and then when there's trauma, any unresolved pain or any discordant wounds there are going to, as we know with trauma, is make this person your enemy. And that's the
Mm.
last thing that we want to see happen.
Hmm. And when you're triggered by trauma, you're not fully in the present moment. So
Right.
you're not really seeing your partner as they are in those moments of flooding.
Right.
You're seeing something else overlaying your partner. And that can escalate conflict also.
Right.
And then the partner doesn't feel seen because they're really not seen in those moments. They're
Right.
seen hopefully in calmer moments where the nervous system is downregulated and they can actually stay present and say, okay, who is this person across from me? Not this rejecting or dismissive figure, maybe somebody frozen, scared,
Mhm.
doesn't want to screw up, doesn't know what to say, is worried about me, and so is saying nothing because they don't want to make it worse. You know,
Mhm.
the same kinds of things that friends and family are afraid to do, also to step forward while they're also suffering as the other parent.
Right. And then also being so afraid of not knowing what to say.
So afraid.
I hear that a lot of I don't know what to say. Then say that.
Yeah, I don't know what to
Say I don't know what to say and I don't know. I try to give couples the permission to say saying I don't know isn't avoidant. It's honesty.
Yeah.
I don't know and I want to come back. I don't know. Can we figure it out together? It's
Right.
a
I don't
great
know when I'm
opportunity.
staying. I'm still, I'm
Yes.
not, I don't know when I'm
Yes.
leaving.
Right. Right. And being able to dance together again and say and that scares me or that upsets me or that pisses me off whatever language the person uses bring that in as a resource.
Yeah. And I don't know. And I hate not knowing
Yes.
because
Yes.
I'm the one who fixes things. I'm the one at work who fixes things. I'm the one people turn to. And
Right.
there's nothing to fix here in certain perinatal situations, right? There's like, what baby has died.
Right.
It's over. That's over.
And that opens up my next set of questions. Is that
Okay.
okay?
Of course.
Then the questions come in how maybe you respond as an EMDR couples therapist of when the questions start coming up, well, are you going to try again?
Oh, right.
Or what happened? What happened?
What
Or
happened?
as we
That's my
talked about, I
favorite one.
remember in one training we had a great conversation about this of when there is when they have a miscarriage and
Yes.
it's early on and people
Yep.
say, well, you weren't even pregnant that long.
And the
And it's like
dismissiveness. Uh-huh.
yes, and it's like, can you just? It would be easier if you just like throat punch them, like instead of like it's a
Don't be
loss.
subtle, just yeah.
Right. You know me, Mara. I'm like
I know,
direct.
but
It's
it's true.
like
It's like don't just
because
say
we
to
don't
me,
have
it's
time.
not real. Just punch me in the face because that's what it feels
Yeah,
like. Absolutely
and we
right.
don't have time. And I see that too. Of we don't have time to waste. Of like these couples are in pain. So
Yeah.
we can be gentle, we can be trauma informed, but also I'm not going to waste your time of how do we get you out of the pain and being able to validate what people are saying.
Yeah.
I feel is one of our biggest
Huge.
advocate poll.
You can't you can't address something that hasn't been seen and
Right,
acknowledged. So the
right,
first step, I think, is for to make space for it to be visible and then to recognize and acknowledge it and say, there it is.
right.
It's right there. And I see it. And also I find individually and with couples, it's so powerful with couples, especially when they're in conflict because they don't understand what's going on with the other one, to
Right.
explain trauma, to explain the neurology, the neurobiology, and
Hmm.
explain why somebody is stuck, for example,
Right. Right.
right? Because it can feel so intentional to, like, can't you just stop? And I say, if they could have stopped, they would have stopped,
Right. Right.
right? This is part of what happens to the nervous system, right? And this is the nervous system's attempt to untangle, and it can't untangle.
Right. And that's where I'm grateful for my EMDR knowledge
Me too.
to
Me
be able
too.
to bring that in and know. And so many, and I'm sure you've seen this over the years of your experience, when do I start doing EMDR? And as a consultant, I always say I'm doing EMDR from day one. I
Yes,
may not be doing reprocessing, which we get
exactly.
into the meat and potatoes. And I've done enough shows on EMDR that people who are listening should know what it is. But
Yeah,
just for our conversation of, where are they getting stuck? What is happening? How are they seeing themselves? What is the world view? Where they're getting stuck is really what
right.
helps me a lot.
And I say to trainees, and to everybody who'll listen, soon as you're thinking through the lens of adaptive information processing, you're doing EMDR.
Mhm.
And it's such an integrative model, in my experience, that we can understand most therapeutic interventions one way or another through the AIP lens, because the adaptive information processing model is a learning model, and we're always learning, and that's not just cognitive, it's like the whole experiential. We're constantly updating our systems,
Mhm.
so one way or
And
another.
I love what you were saying too, which is a big part of my couples work is going into when the trauma, as we say in EFT, this is the demon dialogue.
This is a demon
So
dialogue.
this is the demon dialogue, and to have that knowledge that this is happening to both of you, I
Yeah.
think is revolutionary in
Yes.
couples work. Because
Yes.
how many of us, and when we've worked with couples, it's like tennis. What he said, she said, they
Right.
didn't, this, that,
Yeah.
this,
Right. And
like
the demon
who paid the
dialogue is all
bill?
about gotcha. Whose fault is
Right.
it?
And I always look at it, sometimes I have to update my analogies a little bit. You remember the movie Gremlins?
Yes.
I'm like, everything's great until midnight and you turn wet, and then it's like hell hates it. I'm like, that gremlin, that's the demon dialogue. It's trying to erode that attachment. It's trying to break it down.
Mm-hmm.
That's its sole
Mm-hmm.
purpose.
Right.
But and this is one of the reasons I fell in love with emotional focused therapy for couples, because it taught me to teach people that this isn't couple or partner versus partner, which is what most of us, I think, grew up seeing. I know I did. It was demon dialogue or the issue against the couple.
Yes.
And then when you see the couple is, oh, wait, we're in this together. Even when I first explain that to couples, you see them look at each other and say, oh, this is happening to both of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're not the enemy. I'm not the enemy. This thing is trying to break us apart.
Mm-hmm.
And then how can we build with that? And then I think we both start pulling in EMDR a little bit and doing some resourcing and being able to give them some skills to be able to understand. And even that conversation, I think that's resourcing, is when you're explaining the adaptive information
Absolutely.
processing.
It is
That because
absolutely.
the, and then you see that, I'm sure you've seen it too, where you see that, you hear that phrase, so I'm not crazy,
Oh, yeah, all the time.
or they're not crazy. No, they're
Yeah.
responding appropriately to a
Yes.
potential threat.
Yes. Yes. And before I was trained in EFT, when I was trained in EMDR, there's one story in particular that stands out to me where a couple came into me um who happened to have had a preemie. Preemie was, I think, in preschool at the time. And this couple was so much conflict, so much conflict, so much conflict. And I think I was using the Gottman model at that time. It was probably early days for me, but it became very clear to me that mom had really been traumatized, both by the birth and by the NICU experience, and by her experience of her partner
Mhm.
in that experience. And after some conversation, we decided to do some EMDR with her.
Okay.
Did a course of EMDR with her, and about, I don't know, halfway through, I get this email from him saying, I don't know what you did, but she's not yelling at me anymore.
Mm.
I just get chills remembering that. And then, we went through, we sort of did this block of work, came back together, and so much of what they had been grappling with each other about had essentially evaporated. That her rage and her hurt, it engaged him and his parts and his dynamic.
Mhm.
When in this case, we could work to kind of get that dance back on track because we cleared the trauma from that NICU experience, from that birth experience, with one of the partners. Sometimes it's both of them, and in this case, it was one.
And then the movement can really take place. I love the analogy you use about getting rid of the scrapnel.
Yeah,
That always
yeah,
just stayed with me of like, you got the scrapnel out.
yeah. You got it right, because you can't heal when you got all this debris.
And it's it's I also try when I'm talking with couples, excuse me, to sort of normalize, to just normalize. It's okay to be irritated with this.
Yes.
It's okay to be agitated, and we can talk about it. We just don't want it to be breaking up the relationship. Like going to the
Yeah.
doctor's copays. One doctor, I can think of people that I've worked with where, and where the birthing parent will say something doesn't feel right,
Yeah. Yep.
and then being told everything's fine. It's like, okay, the one thing I've learned in my years, like, never ignore
Uh-huh.
someone's intuition about their
Right.
body,
Correct.
and then and then it just stops, and then so what do you do? And then the anxiety, the
Mm,
stress, the work, something's wrong, and the people I'm supposed to trust,
don't believe me.
now we're opening the door for new traumas, right? So now I can't trust these professionals,
Right.
and then
Or
they
my
find out
partner is
something's
telling me
wrong.
I'm overreacting, perhaps.
Right, right, right,
Or a parent or a sibling or a good friend who says, fine.
right, right. Now, what is some advice that you have for people who are interested in EMDR and who work with perinatal? And couples? Let's throw all
People
three in.
like us.
Maybe like us. What are some of the advice, or what are some of the issues that you see that you wish you could say, I want you to know
Hmm.
this. I want you to understand this.
Oh
I
my
want you
gosh.
to
Hold
let
on, I gotta
go.
go get my
I know.
list.
I'm like, we might have to do it again. We'll have 2 years of Friday Night
Yeah,
Feels.
really.
Um,
Ooh.
because I know I have a good list of things that I
Mhm.
see, and you and I usually tag each, or I tag you of like,
Yeah,
I just am like, Mara, just and you'll
yeah.
respond. But
Beautiful
it's
language.
what are some things that you wish that clinicians would understand and really update their knowledge on?
About the
All
intersection of
three.
the
Yes, I mean, giddy up,
yeah.
Mara. This is Friday Night
Yeah,
Feels. We
right.
have no
Well, because
filters
I could
here.
update you on the perinatal, could update you on the couples in the perinatal. No, I mean, really, we've many intersections here. Oh my gosh. Okay. Should we start with my favorite about EMDR and pregnancy, or should
Oh
we
my
save
gosh,
that for
please. I was
later?
hoping. I was hoping. I was hoping because that's the one where it just you read these questions and you hear them, and not all of them. Some of them are very genuine because they don't know, or if you're seeing someone fresh out
Yeah.
of grad school. But when you have seasoned clinicians,
It's remarkable to me also when people think that they should answer a question when they really don't actually have access to all of the information. So, for example, somebody who does EMDR and works with couples, and a partner comes in, or they come in and announce, they're pregnant, and suddenly they think the EMDR piece has to stop
mhm,
because they mean well, but they don't have the perinatal knowledge. Like they don't,
right,
right? So they're missing large pieces of information. So, I always want to start off by saying that, these clinicians, they mean well when they say they think don't do reprocessing in the first trimester, or don't do reprocessing in the third trimester, or don't do reprocessing in the second trimester, all of which I've heard, by the way,
right, right,
none of which has any evidence base to support it.
right,
Um, the fears have to do with um, intense heart rate, uh, cortisol. But here's what people really need to understand. There is a mountain and I mean a mountain of evidence, many years old at this point, to show that untreated or inadequately treated PTSD, depression, and anxiety do massive damage to not just to the pregnant person, obviously the person who's suffering, but to the pregnancy, the status of the pregnancy, and to the developing fetus through infancy and into growing up. So, I mean, there are so many categories of adverse events that we see, because what's happening is when we have untreated anxiety, depression, and PTSD during pregnancy, that's categorized as toxic stress on the body. And it's toxic stress that we all want to avoid. And so when clinicians are afraid to utilize any phase of EMDR during pregnancy, what I think, what they may not have the language to say this, but what they're afraid of is inducing toxic stress. But actually, what the evidence shows is that our trauma-focused treatments, and not just EMDR, by the way, but trauma-focused treatments resemble what we call adaptive stress, which is, see, not all stress is bad.
Right.
Right.
It moves me at times to get to where I need to be.
Absolutely. And we all know that, you know, that curve of stress, like low stress means you're not doing anything. Medium amounts of stress means you're mobilized, and too much stress means you're not functioning. And in pregnancy, there is a certain amount of adaptive stress where there's the body stresses and then recovers, stresses and then recovers. That's just part of life. That actually entrains the nervous system of the developing fetus, which means that it shapes the development of that nervous system so that it has better stress buffering, stress resistance, both in utero and after birth. So the normative experiences of stress and recovery are adaptive. And our trauma-focused therapies, including EMDR, are more like adaptive stress and do not look like toxic stress. And then in the middle category, we have something called tolerable stress, which is where you've got some stress that may be more prolonged than you would like to see. But when there is an other to connect with, when there is a partner, there's a therapist to help you keep one foot in the present moment. Something that may be experienced as toxic stress can be experienced instead by the body as tolerable stress, which is better. So one thing that I really want EMDR therapists to hear is, do not make blanket statements about it not being okay to do EMDR during pregnancy, this phase or that phase. And I've even heard people say things like, well, don't use it during a high-risk pregnancy. I'm like, high-risk pregnancy, that phrase encompasses 1,000 kinds of pregnancies. Right? So if somebody, for example, is in preterm labor, not high blood pressure, nothing dangerous happening in their body, the pregnancy is at risk because of preterm labor. There might be some reprocessing that will actually reduce stress in that person's body. Will it stop the preterm labor? I have absolutely no idea. Will it make it worse? Very unlikely, because that's not what the preterm labor is from.
Right. And it kind of reminds me of people when they
right. Let me just say,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say, if we could put people in labor by doing EMDR reprocessing, I'd have a new business venture, because I'd have people lined up around the block.
Right.
We don't really actually know how we start and stop labor, by the way.
Right.
So it's this fantasy that we're causing all these things, and also makes me worry about what EMDR clinicians think we're doing to the body when we're doing reprocessing. Like, hang on.
And also the fear that they don't understand trauma.
Right.
And you know, when I'm right, and being exactly, and well, I don't want to, you know, the fear of, well, I don't want to induce this, or I don't want them to have a panic. It's like, but they already are. It's
already happening. The exposure you're afraid of, this exposure that you're afraid is going to happen, is already happening.
100%. And what you're going to do with EMDR is, yes, it's painful, and we validate that, but that's why we have a system to prepare and help clients feel comfortable to be able to do, you know, the heavy lifting. But then it's processed.
And it's processed. And part of the process, and I've been thinking a lot about this because I've been doing some writing. So I've had to really think about how to articulate this. People are experiencing their depression, their anxiety, their trauma, their PTSD day to day all the time, and it ebbs and flows as it always
Right.
does. In treatment, we are explicitly with reprocessing, keeping one foot in the present moment within a relational frame. Those two things just themselves make going into a trauma memory qualitatively different than what people are experiencing day to day. And it's
And it
that dual
gets the
attention.
shrapnel out.
And it gets the shrapnel out, and it gets everything moving. And we know that it's the dual attention stimulus and the BLS that mobilize.
Right.
And
And I also kind of, I pepper this in too when someone's struggling with that, with an EMDR therapist of, they're afraid they're going to do something wrong or hurt the person, which in the spirit of good care, I get, but
absolutely,
it's holding them
no
back.
harm.
But when we're talking about dual attention stimuli and bilateral stimulation, that's how I explain EMDR to people because we do it every day. So one of the examples I love to use is, if you see a child or a toddler who's crying or upset, what do you do? Well, I pick them up and they said, and you rock them, right?
Uh-huh.
And what happens? Well, they calm down.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
Or what is it like when you're on vacation and you're in a hammock or a rocking chair and you're going back and forth? That's the dual attention stimulator by BLS. And it's helping the brain to calm runners when they go for a run, or people who power walk, or when you're at the gym. People, all the different ways. Because I always think that EMDR, this is my belief, EMDR is so complex, as we know. And part of what I like to do in my work is see how can I translate this so that every person who walks into my office knows that EMDR is appropriate for them
Yeah.
in some level,
Yeah, because EMDR
and
is
that it's
aphasic.
natural, and that it's natural. You walked, you did this, you picked up, or you moved your head side to side. You're already doing it. We're now just putting in a structure to target areas that are causing you pain.
Exactly. Yeah, I like that analogy.
And then being able to bring that into, if there are, talking about trauma, hello COVID, where and that could be a whole other discussion of opening a can of worms of what it was like to have to go to the hospital and not have your family there, or only have one person, or if you're vaccinated, like all the million things that the last
So
3 years
right. Well,
have
you hear
led to.
people now talking about their COVID babies, right?
Yes.
Some of whom are now almost 3.
Right.
So these babies born into a pandemic, during the pandemic, during various phases of the pandemic, when rules were changing and nobody knew who's
Right.
allowed on the unit, who's allowed in the NICU.
Right. And then when you're talking about couples, when the partners react and respond differently to those type of situations, can lead to more ruptures in the relationship. And it's funny, sometimes you hear that question or the fear of, will EMDR end my relationship? Or will couples therapy end my relationship? And I I always just say, it's like, well, that's not, EMDR therapy is not going to do that. EMDR and therapy and support are going to just help take away some of the confusion. And what you do with that clarity is
Yeah,
then you're making an adaptive response. You're able to listen to it you're responding instead of reacting.
exactly. Clarity is the word that I often use with people too.
Yes.
It kind of clears away the clutter, it clears the fog, so that you can again be fully present and look around and see, okay, what's happening?
Right.
What do I want to
And I
do?
also, and I don't know about you, but sometimes when I'm working with a new couple, I always ask them, it's like, why are you here? Like, a little warmer than that, but like,
Yeah,
is
yeah,
it, but I want to know, is it,
yeah.
because we see the spectrum. Do you want the relationship to work? Do you want the relationship to end? Do you not know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then
Mm-hmm.
I picked this up from someone where I remember my jaw dropped, shattering the Disney trauma that I held on to, when a clinician told me, how did they explain it? Something about, talking about couples of, you have to let go of the fear that the relationship is not going to work.
Exactly. Because a couple deciding to separate is a I hate the word success or failure, but it's a reasonable outcome. There's a
Right.
decision, there's
Free will
a
choice.
clarity. Yeah,
And you
yeah.
may choose to not be in this relationship. I think when we tie in specifically, let's say in the States, a
Hmm.
reference point of marriage, right? I always joke that there's sort of like a little curse in the word marriage that
Oh
couples
yeah.
who do really well, once they get married, it's like they tweak a little bit and
I
now I have to
noticed
be the
that.
perfect partner. And you get to define and create your own marriage or
Mhm.
long-term relationship or whatever relationship you want. But I've noticed that there's a energy there that
Yeah,
holds power for people.
yeah.
But when I have conversations with couples and on any level of being able to say this relationship could end today, and they just look at me like, oh my god, no, like you're not supposed to say it, right? Like
Hmm.
we're not supposed to talk about Bruno, we're not supposed to
Yeah,
talk
we
about
are not.
trauma, we're not
Yep.
supposed to talk about perinatal trauma, we're not supposed to talk about any of it. But when you start looking at it, and I feel from trauma informed and adaptive information or processing method, you want to be with your partner because you want to be with your partner and not because you have to be or you need to be.
Yeah, yeah,
And I remember years ago when I heard that, it took my breath away because I didn't know that I was even living in
yeah.
fear about
Hmm.
losing the relationships.
Yes. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's so woven in so often. It's so important to make it explicit. I think I had a similar aha moment along my journey too, where the realization that um that for a couple to decide to separate didn't mean that I had failed them as a therapist
Right.
or that they had failed, just simply that they were able to gain some clarity about whatever the issues were enough and themselves, what mattered to them to decide what was going to be best for them and their family.
Right. Right. And and even hearing you say that, like the word failure, why does that even have a role when we're
I
talking
know,
about love and when
I
we're
know.
talking about relationships? It's
Right. It's
sad, right? You know,
simplistic.
and
It is.
it,
Yeah.
but how, even when people are listening to this, it's like, have I ever worried about failing my relationship? And where does that come from? Who taught you that?
Yeah.
And,
It's
when we're
and it
talking
is
about,
so cultural.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. And be in those belief systems that are so integral and like you said, interwoven. I just think of like an an evil like Rumpelstiltskin,
Yeah.
just like, oh, we're just gonna like weave into this, and
Yep. Yep.
then
Sprinkle
you
it
don't even
everywhere.
know the spell is won. And also the other one that just made me think of is when couples feel or believe that they shouldn't get help when they're
Hmm.
struggling. Like I should
Hmm.
know how to we should be able to do this on our own.
Yeah.
And so talk about there's not only more scrapnel in a relationship, especially when we're talking about perinatal related traumas or any sort of relationship traumas, the belief that we're supposed to do this on our own, that infection is just going to grow.
Right. Like that there's shame in not being able to figure this out
Right.
ourselves.
Right.
Right. And there's fear of exposure too.
And I think there's also fear that if we talk about it, it's going to be real. If we have to go get professional help,
Mhm.
so, then
And I
it's
need to
really
be able to
bad.
hear what you're saying, or I need to put words to
Right.
what I'm feeling. You're right. It makes it so real
Right.
and scary.
And and then the fear that I'm going to, when we kind of project onto our partners, of they're going to say the thing I'm afraid of them saying in front of another person.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And then my worst nightmare that you do blame me for the loss, or you do blame me for this, or I shouldn't have taken the road, the work trip when I knew you were, like all these
Right, right,
different
right, right.
scenarios when we're looking at
Yeah,
the intricacies of the struggles of relationships.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Right. The blame. People are waiting for the blame and the gotcha.
Right, right, right.
Yeah.
Lots of good stuff, Mara. Oh my goodness.
So much. So intricate.
And this is one thing too that I kind of want to just touch on because we're talking a lot about a lot of important and heavy components, right, of the work of couples therapy, of perinatal work, of trauma. But one of the pieces that I always like to talk about, and I actually got a little bit of flack once for saying this, was how much fun EMDR with couples can really be.
Oh, totally. You got
And
flack for that? I'm sorry.
it's okay.
Uh-huh.
I deflected the rejection, so don't you
Okay.
worry.
I
It
mean,
was
it's not
well,
always fun, but it can be.
but in the sense of if we're looking at it clinically, it's not the same of like going to the circus, but it's fun because it lets you as a clinician really come into your own when you
Hmm.
trust yourself, when you believe yourself, when you follow the protocol, when because you can pull in all different aspects of your therapeutic orientation of and
Yep.
how many people do we have like you do with yoga and all of the different amazing therapies that you've studied of when people bring in creative expression and art therapy and writing and
And
mindfulness
parts work. I mean,
and
parts
parts
work
work
in EMDR and couples and perinatal. Oh my gosh.
and also reality therapy a little of like yeah, let's keep it
Yeah.
real, people. Let's keep it real.
Yeah.
And gentleness and spirituality and
Hmm.
religious and cultural beliefs. I think when people are going through their basic trainings for EMDR, there's this fear of I have to be an EMDR trainer or I'm trained, this is all I can do. And I always guide people of consultees of this is just the beginning and it only gets better
Yes.
when you
Agreed.
practice you're going to and then you're going to see and this is maybe where I say fun because then you see the hope then you see the clients who are all of a sudden
Yes.
not screaming anymore or not having panic attacks when they're in public
Exactly.
and you see I think one of the gifts of as a good therapist is when you see past all the crap and you see the person
Yeah.
and I love doing what I do because that is the most beautiful humbling gift that I receive every session
Yeah. It's such
every
powerful
training.
work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we come in in a field where there was such an abuse of power, right? And the differentiation, like I'm the expert, and I'm
Yeah.
here,
Yeah. Yeah. The
and I think we're still
hierarchical approach.
really coming out of that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Ag-
being able to say, no, we're in this together. I'm good.
Exactly.
I'm in the trenches with you as much as I can be to fight with you.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. And when I think about perinatal work, I always say to clients, you're not crazy and you're not alone.
Right,
And to clinicians, I say, remember, it's not us and them. It's always us. It's
right,
all us, right? Could happen to anybody, these situations.
right.
And, you'd be hard pressed to find somebody who has not been touched in some way by a perinatal situation of some kind, whether it's them personally, whether it's a family member or a friend or a neighbor. And people will always say, when a perinatal crisis happens to them, all of a sudden, all these people come out of the woodwork. People they
Mhm.
had no idea had had a stillbirth or a
Right.
bunch of miscarriages or a traumatic delivery or a
Or
baby in the NICU
infertility.
or infertility. Yeah, all of those things, sometimes a combination.
Hmm. And it's interesting too, as you say that the last few years, I've noticed a trend where more celebrities are
Yeah,
talking about it,
yes,
which to
helps.
me is a non-celebrity.
Yeah,
it's always you kind of put not on a pedestal. You're like, well, they have all the money, they could do all the thing of like, wait a minute, it's the same. They have access to everything, but they still not the same, but similar. Like
yeah, but there's still trauma, still loss.
yes, still trauma, and
Money can't
it
prevent all the things,
right.
all the bad things.
So, what are some of the things, as we kind of wind down today a little bit, of what are some of the things that you're working on right now? Like you said, you were doing some writing and you and I have chatted about it. What are
Yeah.
some of the exciting projects you're bringing out?
There are ever so many things. I mean, I'm collaborating on a couple of chapters that are going to be submitted in about 10 days. For
Ooh,
the Oxford Handbook of EMDR, collaborating
wow,
on two chapters.
congratulations.
It's so exciting with Paul Miller and Marlene Sinclair in the UK on EMDR and perinatal mental health. So that's where I've been, reading all the literature and
Mhm.
feels like all the literature, and writing and trying to kind of really integrate and conceptualize. I my company, the Touchstone Institute, and my team have been building out some very cool trainings. Trainings not just the ones that I'm involved in.
Okay.
I have trainings that I give alone and with my writing partner for the books that we wrote years ago, Debbie Davis. But we have some new instructors coming on board and, sort of gradually onboarding people and getting new training scheduled so that we really want to, be the place to go for people who want more training on EMDR and perinatal mental health, but not just EMDR, really all about perinatal trauma, how to best support families, how to best understand families when there's a perinatal issue that's happening. So I have some trainings that I've done with my writing partner, Debbie Davis. She and I wrote 2 books together for parents of babies in the NICU.
Oh, wow.
And so this is not only for EMDR therapists, although I do teach the AIP model at the beginning when we talk about frameworks and how to understand what's happening for families. So EMDR therapists will definitely benefit from it as well. So just lots of excitement brewing around, like, how can we support the therapy community?
Right.
Right? The perinatal, how do we
Because
support
people may not
perinatal
want to do
sessions?
EMDR, it's not their
Exactly.
jam.
Or it's another
But
training or they haven't gotten to it.
right. And
Right.
in our field, trainings are, it's time and money, and
It
you can
is.
only do so much. So that's great that
Exactly.
you're doing trainings for people who want to know more and want to know, like the powerhouses in the field.
Yeah, and that's who we're inviting. I mean, that's really who we want teaching for us, are the people who, we really have a good sense of the work that they're doing, and they're trauma focused, bottom up kinds of work rather than the sort of top down, trying to only mostly manage symptoms as opposed to let's try to kind of clear this away. And
Right.
also really understanding what happens. Because like you said, then we opened with this idea that, even seeing and validating, acknowledging what is true is therapeutic and
Right.
adaptive.
Right.
And when clinicians don't yet know what they're looking at and all the nuances of what they're seeing, most people can understand death, loss, trauma, the big pieces of shrapnel that are sticking out of the body. But there's so much shredded connective tissue that happens in perinatal trauma because this period is a developmental period. And so what we want to do is help hone clinicians' capacity to hear the nuances, to understand the dynamics in a deeper way so that they know how to think about what's happening. So that no matter what situation they face with clients, they have a way to think through where's the wound, what's happening here, what do people need in order to keep their heads above water in this situation.
Right.
And so there's lots and lots and lots and lots of concepts that if we were to put it through the AIP lens, I could and I do teach it that way. And if I'm teaching EMDR clinicians, I can teach you how to utilize the method with EMDR. If we're talking about brain spotting, we can talk about that. If we're going to talk about how to utilize, how to implement in couples work, we can talk about that. But the bottom line is you first have to understand what is it that's actually happening here. Because there are a lot of myths. There really are a lot of myths in perinatal work about bonding and attachment, about iatrogenic, like the parents' impact on their kids and what causes certain things to happen. And there's just a lot of stuff that just sort of floating out there that isn't really well supported.
Right. Right. Well, that's so exciting. Congratulations on all the great things, and I can't wait to see all of those. And also, I'm just thinking, it's revolutionizing our fields, because going back to, I bet now, hopefully grad school programs are saying, hey, we need to talk about this because it's a prominent issue that we're going through. And also, it that avoidance piece. I was just thinking of, my own program of, and how many clinicians I've heard say, well, I don't want to deal with this. Sort of like when we're talking
Oh,
about addictions, like, I don't
yeah.
want to deal with addictions. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, like, I don't want
Yeah.
to deal with air, but, like, I'm still going to
Right,
breathe
right. Or people
because
who
it's
say I don't
everywhere.
treat trauma. Like, well,
What are you
okay.
doing? What are you doing?
Yeah,
Get it
exactly.
together.
It's
Get it together.
everywhere. It's
Well, and
everywhere.
the other piece too, and this isn't, that I see, and I'll just say this before we kind of wind down, is is also being able to know what your experiences are, what your expertise is, what your
Yes.
clinical expertise is, and especially when we're talking about couples,
Hmm.
if you don't have any experience with couples, you may not want to jump in just because you've learned EMDR or because you understand perinatal, or like
Right.
it has to be the
Totally.
perfect combination of I have these experiences, or let's refer out or pull in some sort of consultation.
Yeah. Well, and this is why I went and got trained in couples work, because I also didn't get trained in couples work in my grad school program or in my, internship or postdoc. So, I'm seeing these couples and I'm like, I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And that's
Right,
not okay.
right.
So, first I did the Gottman training. And then the day I sent in my videos for certification, the next day I went to my first EFT training.
I love EFT. We could talk about that all
We
day.
could
Like
talk about all
I,
day.
because I didn't do Gottman because it just wasn't my energy. But like EFT, I just absolutely
Listen,
fell in love
I
with.
think I needed Gottman first because I had couples screaming at each other, and
Mm,
the getting them to stop screaming at each other part was very appealing to me at that point, and it was
yes.
earlier in my development in my career. And then it took, takes a bunch of years to get through the process, probably 3 years. And then I was ready for EFT because what I was seeing is that Gottman worked great for couples who were securely attached.
Hmm.
Not so great for couples who were insecurely attached,
Right. Right.
right? Like we could get them to do stuff in the room, but didn't carry over
Outside.
as easily.
Right.
Yeah. And so, but it is funny to go from Gottman training to EFT training because they show you the demos. The first day, I remember kind of gripping my arm rests, going, he's flooding, he's flooding, he's flooding, interrupt him, he's flooding. Because, that's what you're supposed to do. It's very
Right.
funny, to
That's
have that,
awesome.
yeah, different approach.
So if you could, as we wind down, well, two questions I have left is how can people connect with you if they have more questions or
Sure.
are interested in any trainings or your work, your writing? How can they connect with you, Mara?
So the best way to reach me and find me is on our website, which is Touchstone Institute, one word, .org.
Okay.
And you can find me there. You can reach me through the website. You can find me on Facebook. I see messages, I respond to messages. If people have questions. In terms of writing, I have an article that came out for those who are connected in the EMDR world. In the EMDRIA, the EMDR International Association does a quarterly newsletter, and I had an article I wrote for them that came out in December, that was called Lessons Learned from Perinatal Mental Health, about sort of managing in sort of an unstable world, in a world that's been turned upside down, as all of
Mhm.
our worlds have been. You know, when the pandemic first happened and everybody was in isolation and washing hands and everything, my whole group of preemie parents were like, "We've got this. We know how to do this.
Yes.
Everybody, stand down. We will
Yes.
lead the way." Because we
Yes.
all came home with our babies and quarantined them for a long time.
Right. 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 And how, what if there is one piece of advice that you could give to anyone listening, what would you want them to walk away with from our conversation today?
I'm such a process thinker. I think what I would really like people to hold on to is, um, to be curious about what you don't know, to be open to recognizing the impact of a trauma that may not look like a trauma to you, but is experienced as a trauma by an individual or a couple,
Mm,
and to want to understand what about this wounded you, and to assume it's real,
right.
assume that it's real.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Moira, for being here on Friday Night Feels, and thank you to everyone who supports and watch it. And just remember, we're on YouTube and all the podcast platforms and everything. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and we will pick up in 2 weeks with another Friday Night Feels. Have a good night, everyone.